Welcome to The Restless Politics Leading with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell. And we're here with, I think it's fair to say, one of the great survivors of modern British politics. So David Davis, MP, a lot of ups and downs in his career. Rory loves a good backstory, and you've got a good backstory, which we'll come on to. But it is quite remarkable that you've kind of come through with 10 leaders of your party, almost became one yourself until that pesky old Etonian David Cameron came along and wiped the floor with you.
Careless of me.
But also played a big role in the evolution of the Tories' position on Europe, and indeed your own evolution on the position of Europe, and yet still with a smile on your face, which is kind of nearly always there. I think, it's going to be interesting to find out about that backstory, but also about where you think the Conservative Party and indeed Britain go now. So thank you for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you for coming. And can we please start with your childhood? The implication is slightly that the Tories are a bunch of privileged, out-of-touch people. But that's not quite true with you, is it? Tell us a little bit about your childhood.
My first memories of growing up are in a prefab. If you know what that is, I mean, generations now don't know.
Rory's got several in the garden.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, so with his tenants in them, no doubt. It's a sort of asbestos box that used to be made in factories in the Second World War to put on places where a bomb had dropped. Just sort of raise the house and stick a prefab on it.
And asbestos is very good for your health, generally.
Asbestos. It's fine for my health. Asbestos is fine as long as you don't drill into it and breathe it. Anyway, there's a bloody health and safety culture already. Anyway, I was brought up by my grandparents because my mother had me. She was a single mum, and in those days, I mean, these days that's nothing about that. But in those days, it was sort of a stigma.
I'm interested. Can I just stop you on that? Because in fact, actually, quite a lot of the people we've been interviewing, including
Bridget.
Yeah, and Lisa Nandy was talking about the fact she had a single mum.
Yeah.
And she is, younger even than me, right?
Yeah.
So she was growing up in the 80s and felt there was huge stigma attached to being a single mum, and she blamed Mrs. Thatcher for it and said she became Labour in a sense because the stigma against single mums.
Unmitigated nonsense. I mean, it's been around forever. I mean, the simple truth is that in the 50s, I mean, generally speaking, you were taken straight to a hospital, straight to an orphanage, or adopted literally even before your mother saw you. Right? It was really that fierce, and the society's view of the mothers was barbaric, right? But my grandparents insisted on raising me, right?
And when were they born? What sort of generation are they?
How could I reference it? I mean, my grandfather went to prison in the 30s,
so he would have been born about 1900 or something, you think?
Probably about during the First World War sometime.
Right, okay.
And he went to prison because he refused to keep quiet.
Oh, you know the story. Yeah. He led. He'd had polio, so he couldn't work anyway. But he and one other guy had led a demonstration in North Shields to get an increase in the dole, in the unemployment benefit, because that was run by local authorities in those days, and they chose their own levels. Right?
And North Shields, this is all the time of the northeast of England, the Jarrow Marches.
This is the Great Depression, mass unemployment.
And he's right up there on the edge of the shipbuilding areas of Newcastle.
Yeah, North Shields is even worse than that in a way. I mean, it was a really down. I mean, it was characterised in the 30s as a down at heel place by comparison with the rest of the country. Anyway, he took his demo to the local authority. They refused to see him. So he did it again. They went back to the beginning of the march and had another march, right? And they refused to see him again. So went back and had another march.
And this is him marching with unemployed people,
with thousands of people
demanding jobs,
demanding a better unemployment benefit because they were starving, and there were various rules that said, for example, if anybody in a household worked, nobody got any money, and so on.
And so he had polio. He wasn't working. His parents were from working class backgrounds as well?
I think so. I don't really know much about that. I know his brother got shot in the face in the First World War. He was also unemployed. He had half his face missing, his brain damaged, and so on. So, I mean, look, it was a gruesome. Somebody tells a story in one of the magazines in those days about North Shields, and they talk about people going down the fish dock, picking up fish from the ground that had been lost so they could eat. That's we have no countenance today
And
of
he was
what poverty really means in those terms.
and he was a communist.
And he's a communist, yeah. He was a member of the National Unemployed Men's Movement, which actually I think Orwell writes about in Wigan Pier, which used to go and protect these people if the bailiffs came, and used to try and raise money for them, and so on. Anyway, that was him. And they on their third demo of the morning or the day, the chief of police comes up and says, "Walter," that's his name, Walter Harrison. He said, "Walter," he says, "you realise if this gets violent, you will be responsible." And my grandfather laughs and says, "Oh, you know me better than that, Chief Inspector." And at that point, the police baton charged the crowd. And, so there's something.
Tory laughs at police brutality.
something. I just thought the conjunction of the conversation, and he said, "All right, okay, you've taken responsibility for it. Now we can,
I'm going to dick you."
and lots of fighting, and quite a lot of people end up in dock the next day, including my granddad and his partner. And this is Judge Goddard, the man who was the member as Lord Justice Goddard, was responsible for the last capital punishment in the UK. That one, right? So he's not a softie, right, in any sense of the word. This is early on in his career. And at the end of the trial, he says to my, I have to paraphrase, I don't know the exact words. He says to my grandfather and his partner, he says, "You two gentlemen are clearly just trying to help your fellow man. So if you are willing to be bound over to keep the peace, by which I mean not make inflammatory speeches, then I will simply do that, bind you over, and that'll be it. Otherwise, I'll have to send you to prison." And my granddad says, "I'm not going to make a promise I can't keep." So he goes to prison for 6 months.
Do you think that's where your kind of, what's the word, libertarian street
I
comes
thought you were going to
from?
say cussedness. But
No. I think this sort of, even though you can sort of laugh about it now, you must sort of, one, I suspect you have massive respect for that. But secondly, it sort of, I think it does explain something about you, actually.
Well, I don't know. Who knows? I know he was more responsible for my early education than the education system was, because I didn't read till I was 7. Right? I was quite a late reader, partly, I think, as a disruption of living there, then go to Catholic school, then get thrown out of that, and so all sorts of things. But anyway, so, and I can remember him quoting me the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. I can remember him also doggerel of all sorts, sort of various things. But also, I don't know. For example, and I don't know why this sticks in my mind, but a charity collector comes to the door, much more common in those days, collecting for one charity or another. And he goes, and bear in mind, he's unemployed himself, and he goes,
and looking after a grandson in a prefab
he goes and gives
asbestos
him a
house.
shilling. 5p in today's parlance. So he goes and gives me a shilling. He comes back, and I remember him muttering about saying, "It should be done by the state. I shouldn't have to pay that." That was then. So something obviously percolated in. What it was, I don't know. But you're right. The whole family admires what he did. He went to prison twice. The other time for chaining himself the railings, number 10.
When was that?
He got closer than I did, obviously.
When did he chain himself to railings number 10? Late 30s?
After a march. At one point I thought it was the Jarrah marches. Then I looked it all up, and it can't have been, because the communists weren't allowed on Jarrah marches. But there were lots of marches in those days.
Right.
And actually the Jarrah march, people don't realise, it was the respectable one.
Right.
It was one the establishment organised.
Right.
People forget. When the Jarrah march got to Leeds, I think it was, the Yorkshire Conservative Post, as it was known then, had a banquet for them. So we forget quite how.
So your grandfather's much more radical than that.
Much more, oh yeah.
So he's right on the far left of politics, and you end up, let's say, not on the far left.
On the far right, yeah, that's right.
I'm not going to say far right.
People like him call me far right.
Yeah, not far right.
But David, just to get the thing straight in my mind, but by the time you've got to know him, that's now in the past, because you've been born 10, 15 years after these events. Yeah. And what was he like?
And actually he's blacklisted at that point. You'll understand that.
Tell us about blacklisting, but also tell us what he was like as a man, what he and your grandmother were like for you as a child. How much did you see of your mother? What sort of people were they?
He was blacklisted. In those days, employers would run a blacklist between themselves, and so somebody had been an activist. So he's also an activist in the coalfields during the war. And a Communist Party member. So for all those reasons, he was blacklisted, and so he couldn't get a job. I think he eventually got a job Clifford's Tower, the castle in York, taking money for the tickets, selling tickets. And this is a man self-educated, but a man of formidable intellectual capacity. Makes me look like a dwarf. I mean, really sort of absolute formidable intellectual capacity. And he's incredibly charismatic. He was a brilliant speaker, could command crowds. And indeed, if you read the newspapers, he's such a figure in my family that one of my uncles, who I never knew for a long time, actually collected all of the writings about him and all of the local paper things and so on. So that's how I know about a lot of it. And they write about him in sort of, not awestruck's the wrong word, but very respectful terms.
Mm.
And this is the Tory papers and Tory local political leaders.
By the time you knew him, you're a young boy,
Yeah.
and did he seem quite old and frail to you, or was he still quite young and vigorous when you knew him and when you were growing up with him?
I just remember him as commanding, as I say, charismatic. I never thought about. Remember, if it's the first family you grow up in, that's normal by definition. If you had 4 arms, it would have been normal to my mind, right? So that was this definition of normality. But he was also very insightful. I remember many years later, I left home in a violent encounter with my stepfather.
How old were you then? Just tell us a little bit about that. Sorry.
That was 18, 19. It was the day I took my A-levels. Stupid me. The day before I took my A-levels, I walked out of the house.
And why did you have a violent confrontation with your stepfather?
Well, this is interesting. This
Yeah.
is my grandfather's insight on
Yeah.
this. Afterwards, he talked to me about it. He said, David, you have to understand that you are the other man in your mother's life to your stepfather. That's how he sees you. You are the representative of the other man. So every success you have is a rebuff to him.
And who was the stepfather?
Just a man who people think of. Whose name I took. His name was Ronald Davis. He was a working class man, sort of semi-skilled. He was mostly a shop steward. His father of the chapel. When he died, it's like his death was like his funeral was like a mafia funeral. 300 people turned up, all come and want to shake my hand.
And where was your dad, your biological father?
He lived in Wales. He was married, as it turned out, when he met my mother, and they had their affair.
And did you ever have?
She didn't know that until afterwards.
Did you have anything to do with him?
I met him once. Probably an uncomfortable meeting for him, I suspect.
And what about for you?
It's interesting, but no more than that. I'd only did it once. I didn't bother again. I didn't want to disrupt his family. He got 3 or 4 other children.
And David, so you did reasonably well, got your A-levels, had a violent confrontation with your stepfather. You then joined the territorial SAS,
Yeah.
21 SAS. Is that because you were actually quite a sort of physical kid? I mean, what sort of sense do we have of you in your late teens?
Pugnacious.
Well, look, listen, it's working class South London society for a start. It's a fairly no nonsense society, shall we say? Things are resolved quite quickly. So that's sort of how I grew up. That was the sort of the environment. I had a year to kill anyway. I needed to raise money to get university because my parents weren't going to. In those days, you had grants and you had a contribution, the parental contribution that was made. And my parents wouldn't even fill in the form, so I couldn't get a grant, let alone get the parental contribution. That was never going to come. And so I thought, I've got to make some money. So it was a mixture. I always laugh and just say I was a mercenary. I did it for the bounty, the parachute. You got £140. Sounds like nothing now. £140 parachute bounty, tax-free parachute bounty. That was half my annual grant, or would have been if I'd had a grant. So it was a mixture of I wanted a parachute. I was interested. Nobody heard of me. See, today everybody knows what the SAS was. Then nobody knew. It was a scrubby little. The regulars, 22, a scrubby little place called Bradbury Lines in Hereford. Nobody really knew about them. The locals knew about, and they were sort of very sort of quiet organisation, mostly funded by the Foreign Office, actually.
And what do you remember about selection? What do you remember about the other characters who were there when you
Oh,
joined?
funnily enough, I had dinner with the remaining 4 2 nights ago at the Special Forces Club. We have a meeting. We have what we call. So this is very bad taste. You're going to get all sorts of terrible comments on social media. We call ourselves the Nuclear Suicide Bombers Club, right? And the reason was our task was to don't jump in behind enemy lines, find the concentrations, the camps, and so on. Maybe you remember that image of the traffic jam of tanks north of Kiev, try and make something like that happen by blowing a bridge or whatever, and then call in the weapons, which would probably be nuclear weapons, given that we would be losing by then, and run like hell. But we didn't really expect to get out of it, So, so that was the task.
I get the sense that the most significant character in your formation was this granddad, who's a communist.
Yeah.
Your parents were Labour.
Yeah.
So this is the question I ask most Tories, which Rory hates me asking: why on earth did you become a Tory?
When I was at university, it was a sort of process. Took about 2 years. Partly, the army in part. We were learning about the Soviet Union, and as a result, since I'm an assiduous lad, I also read lots of background data on the Soviet Union and didn't really like this extreme form of socialism, right? And I started to think about what made societies what they were like. I did a bit of reading into the history of British background, and I came to the conclusion actually the most fundamental important thing about societies was the individual, not the state, the freedom of the individual, the rule of law, the institutional structure. There's a man called Landis who wrote a book called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations.
Mhm.
And I'm grotesquely summarizing, but the outcome of that was really the most successful colonized nations were British colonized nations. Why? Because they took our institutions, whether it's India or Canada or Australia, whatever. They took our institutions, and indeed for that matter, the United States. They took our institutions, our rule of law, our approach to things, our mindset, and that made them successful. So it was sort of a rather sort of theoretical thing. And I was at Warwick University, which was a hotbed of student socialism and so on, and demos. In fact, I led a demo on behalf of Rudi Dutschke. You remember that person?
Who's this person you led a demo for?
Rudi Dutschke was somebody who was arrested by the German state for being too left-wing, I think. I can't remember what it was now, but and he was locked up, and it seemed to me that was inappropriate, so I led the demo.
You're always jumping in with left causes. It's like you and Shami Chakrabarti on civil liberties. It's like Rory was saying when we were chatting about you earlier, you have sometimes these weird combinations of positions that you take.
Well, I just view them as utterly logical. You see, he's an establishment man. He doesn't require logic,
Just tradition.
Exactly.
This
See,
sort of
you
strange,
see, I
unfocused tradition.
you did PPE like Cameron.
That's right, of course,
Yeah,
absolutely.
and I used to say to Cameron, when I was just teasing him, I said, well, you know what PPE stands for, don't you? And he looks at me blankly. I said, piss poor economist. Although somebody the other day, and I was sitting next to an engineer, I told that story, and he said, no, it stands for piss poor at everything. There is a serious point behind this badinage, and that is a lot of people's politics is not remotely logical. It's by which pack you're in. You should know this better than anybody. You're the best example. Which pack you're a member of.
Which team you're on.
Which team you're on. No,
Yeah.
you put it that way,
Yeah,
but I
yeah.
prefer the biological, sort of wolf pack.
We should say for those who are listening, not watching, you were pointing at me, not Rory. At that point.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Oh, he's a lamb. You're a wolf.
It's true. It's true. It's true. He is a wolf. Yeah.
So I sort of reject that. I always try. Let me give you the most recent example. Is Assange, right? Now, I don't approve of Julian Assange. I don't approve of many things he did, but that always in me triggers the first requirement: am I applying the same standards? Right? Because many people will, if they don't like the person on the receipt of an injustice, don't care, or they care less, right? And one of my little internal triggers is if I don't like the person, I've got to make very, very sure that what we're doing to them or with them is
Doubly right.
right. Yeah. And so Assange I don't like, but he wasn't a sort of cyber spy, or he didn't kill people, despite what they claimed, the Americans. He just embarrassed the American government, as actually Joe Biden has now admitted. So, that's a classic case. And I was just applying the logic of, what sort of approach should we take to somebody who's a sort of journalist, sort of blogger sort of thing, and that's what I try and do. And of course, it does strike people as odd because it cuts across the pack mentalities. We were talking earlier about our conversation, right? When I was still working with Tate and Lyle, I was still director of Tate & Lyle, and I was looking at maybe trying to buy
Tate & Lyle, for listeners, a big sugar company.
bigger sugar company. Yeah, that's
And,
right.
and you still put 3 sugars in your
Three
tea.
Yeah,
sugars in your
absolutely.
tea. Is that as homage to Tate Lyle?
No, it's my addiction to white powder. This one's still legal until your lot.
But you're absolutely your commitment to big sugar goes all the way. It would be
All
like,
the way.
It'd be like Ken
To my
Clark
death, no
smoking
doubt.
40 a day. Yeah, exactly.
You know, but I was saying this story, and I'd been to the city raising money for this, and I was struck how easy it was. Right, I thought I got 300 million in the morning, just wandering around with one piece of paper, and I thought, God, these guys are thick. Talking about bankers, you know. Anyway, so I walked around, and at the time,
The Daily Mirror.
the Daily Mirror, yeah, Robert Maxwell had died. He'd asset stripped the pension fund, stolen money from the pension fund. Let's be plain with
Distinguished
that.
former Member of Parliament, Robert Maxwell.
Former Labour Member of Parliament. I
Yeah.
would stress this since we're on PACs. He was that wolf pack, and he was standing there looking a bit miserable. Actually, I don't know why, but he was still standing in the lobby.
Me.
Alastair.
Yeah. So I'm sorry, I'm pointing at Alice. I beg your pardon. And I thought, and all my Tory friends, all my fellow MPs were delighted about the demise of the Mirror. Right now, this offended my sense of propriety because I think there's always got to be at least 2 players in a game to work, you know. And so I thought, no, we don't want the Mirror to die. It's important to keep it. And I went up to him and I said, could you run the Mirror? And he sort of looked and said, of course I could. And I said, no, Alistair, I don't mean write a 30-page polemic. I know you can do that.
Do that every day.
I said, could you actually run it to get more customers? And he obviously realised I was talking. He thought for a second. He said, yeah, I could. I said, well, why don't I buy it for you? And I'll chair it and you can run it. Okay. And he sort of looked at me completely perplexed. I said, look, the ball's in your court. If you want to do it, I'll fix it. Right. And then 2 weeks later, I think Blair employed him. So history went one way rather than another. But that's it. But you see, for me, that was just logical. It didn't matter he's an obvious Labour supporter. It didn't matter that, you know, it was a logical protection of an institution which mattered. And then my colleagues would say that's irrational or or odd. I say, no, that's just fits the system that you're probably right. I probably inherited from my granddad.
But David, on the contradictory side, there have been times in your life when you've made statements in favour of the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
You've had different views on gay marriage.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that. Tell us about those more conservative positions.
Well, the death penalty was always a theoretical position. What I always said was, look, what's wrong with the death penalty is that you get the wrong person. That you execute somebody and then find out afterwards that you made a mistake. And the British judiciary are a lot less, they're a lot more fallible than we like to kid ourselves. I mean, the whole judicial system is a lot more fallible. So my point was a moral one, that, you know, if it's right for Obama to sit down every Thursday morning and sign off a dozen people to be killed by drone, possibly surrounded by their family or a wedding party or whatever, if we think that's right, then the people who think that's right ought to say, well, if you could actually be sure of your conviction, and there are ways possibly of doing that, then it's logical. That was it. It was an argument in logic, right?
So logically, you thought if you could get the right person, they were guilty, you'd be happy to have a murderer killed, whatever
Yes,
happened.
that's it. Yeah.
And then I mean, obviously, I profoundly disagree with you, but that's not where we're going.
But the point I was trying to make very badly, because of course what happens is the media grab the headline, Davis in favour of the death penalty, and pay no attention to the sort of PhD thesis behind it. But there you go.
Sure. I mean, but actually,
We're used to that.
you kind of know that. You kind of know that. The PhD
So then
thesis
the
behind it is
provocative
not.
bit of me comes
The
out.
PhD thesis in politics is not a big thing, is it?
Yeah. Well, you're a demonstration
Okay,
of that.
then tell us exactly. I'm a demonstration of that. Tell us a little bit about then your views historically, your views on abortion, on gay marriage, and these kind of issues.
Well, let's deal with gay marriage because it's the most contentious one. And the irony, people tease me. I mean, look, I've got a lot of gay friends, and they tease me and say, "But you gave the speech at one of the first gay marriages," which I did. My point there was more about people who believe homosexuality is a mortal sin, in which you would find a large number of priests. And we're saying to them, you have to carry out this service. Right?
But we're not actually saying that, are we? Because of course
well,
it was
we did
civil.
in effect.
Because it's a civil
we did in
service.
effect. I mean,
nobody's compelling a priest to
you
to
look
do
at the
this
number.
service.
Look at the number of priests who are no longer priests. I'm sorry, that's not right. I mean, and at the time I raised the issue, nobody was interested. I mean,
Listen,
people.
wait, David, let me push back on this, because I was passionately in favour of this gay marriage thing, and it's about the separation of church and state. What I said to the church and the priests is, If you don't want to marry them, it's up to you. That's up to the
Yeah, but that
church.
isn't the
All we're
law.
doing
But that isn't the
is
law.
we don't control the church. In law, this is a marriage and it's a civil
That
marriage.
isn't the law. If you carry out marriages, you carry out marriages, and that's that. I'm afraid. And
So
I
again, you're just being kind of a bit contrarian.
what I try and do is, if a case is unpopular for and very often it's because it's overgeneralized. This is a very good case in point. It's overgeneralized. You know, people just say, "Oh, well, I know what I want. I forget all the details." Parliament's there to make sure the details are right. That if you do that, you've got protection for somebody who refuses to carry out a particular institutional thing like a marriage, and so contrarian maybe. It's more. I just don't. I don't. Listen, I don't think my profession is very brave, right? And so I try not to allow myself to flinch if it gets difficult. I try. I'm not always successful, but I try not to.
David, it's a very macho way of putting it, but another way of putting it is that you were wrong. I mean, history's passed you
No,
by.
that's
That
just you and the establishment thinking I'm wrong. That's normal. I'm used to that, Rory.
that basically, no, it's not me as the establishment. It's most
Yes,
of
you are.
most of the British population, David, now recognises that gay marriage was the correct thing to do. The support that you would have had 30 years ago for that has vanished. There are vanishingly few people now left in Britain who would want to reverse that.
No, I wouldn't reverse
And
it. It's done. I mean, the damage is done. It was done in the first year.
But you still
and
see it as
what was
damage.
the great damage,
Yeah,
David?
damage to the individ- not the
What was the
people-
damage? Come on.
To people who have that faith, no longer can carry out a marriage, and that's that. It's gone.
What do you mean they can't carry on marriage? They can continue to marriage couple.
Go back, look. Go back, look. It's not the case.
So, and David, do you ever admit you're wrong on anything?
Oh, never.
Go on, what have you been wrong on?
What have I been wrong on? What have I been wrong on?
Because actually, I think on the death penalty, you're getting towards saying you were wrong and you regret it.
No. I mean, I made the point. Oh no, look, you sort of make it sound as though I campaigned for the death penalty. I didn't. I said, look, this is not logical. What you're arguing.
But all these explanations make me sound as though you're less comfortable with that position than you were. No. Okay, so what have you changed your mind on then?
Well, let me give you an example of where you're wrong. Brexit.
Oh yeah, of course, I knew that would come up. I mean,
you
you two. I mean,
said-
this is the pro-Brexit station. Huh? Yeah, of course,
You
say
said
that.
you said that we would have within 2 years a free trade area massively bigger than the EU.
Yeah, well, I was wrong about that.
Admitted you was wrong. What about? But you did have a very. I knew you for a long time.
Yeah.
I've known you since you were an MP in 1987.
Pretty much, yeah.
So you've gone through your own evolution on Europe
Mm-hmm.
because you'd been Minister for Europe under John Major, and because you were quite good at the kind of the politics of that. I think people had a sense of you being quite pro-European. Certainly not a skeptic in the way that we saw Bill Cash or something like that. And then you became quite a prominent figure within the Brexit campaign. But unlike some of the others, you haven't allowed yourself to be kind of defined by that.
Yeah, well, firstly, I don't think it's the most important thing that's happened in the last 5 years.
Oh, seriously?
Yeah, well, the pandemic, there's Ukraine, there's all sorts of things.
You don't think Brexit is the most lasting change?
Let me finish the thing. But the other thing is, of course, what you're talking about is, again, an illusion. In the early major days, the big issue was the Maastricht Treaty, right? And the House of Commons, before the 92 election, had sort of signed off the Maastricht Treaty pretty much unanimously, including the Bill Cashes of the world, right? Okay. And then when we came back, they did the same again. I think there were two sort of in principle votes. And I was a whip. And then we started to have a real problem. The party's approach to it unpicked in a big way. Sometimes for quite reasonable reasons, but sometimes I think just because people fell out with the government. And I was whip, and I took the view, well, look, the government's decided this. It's been elected on this in 92, and it needs to be delivered. And people deduced from the fact that I was effectively the person who delivered the Maastricht Treaty, even the opponents will tell you that, through gritted teeth, in Parliament, that somehow I was a great enthusiast for it. And I never was. I thought there were lots of flaws in it, but that was the decision, and it was done. And indeed, when Major made me a Europe minister, I mean, I'm afraid I can't say on a public channel quite what the expletive was, but I said, you must be blank joking, and he said, no, I want you to do it. And literally, I was one of those horrible people who stalled the entire reshuffle for 2 hours while he tried to find somebody else that Douglas Hurd would accept, and Douglas Hurd refused a number of other ministers of state before insisting, and I gave in. I did the job.
And what were your doubts, and what was Douglas Hurd's insistence
Well,
about?
because my view was that I was not at all sure about the political dimension of the single market. I mean, the economic dimensions are fine as far as they went, but the political dimension of the single market, I was not sure about, and it was just a hunch. There were no facts behind it at this point, but it was a hunch that was sort of proven right later, and that is that the single market became less and less important in the world at large. I mean, you cast your mind back to 95, we had a spectacular improvement in world trade arrangements, lower tariffs and so on. It's probably the biggest, the most important thing that's happened in the modern history of the world. 1.5 billion people came out of poverty, mostly in Asia, but not entirely. Came out of absolute poverty, starvation type poverty, off the back of the world trade development, right? And as a result, a side effect of this is it may be by comparison a trivial side effect. From 72 until 95, our market share, UK market share in Europe, had basically doubled from about 4% to about 8%. From 95 until 2016, it halved again. Now, that's actually quite a healthy thing because the world was opening up and the common external tariff barrier was one of the things that came down. But one of the problems was what Europe did was replace the common external tariff barrier with regulatory barriers. And I don't approve of that. I think that's a bad thing. And I think it's going to kill Europe in the longer run.
And those regulatory barriers are trying to ensure that standards.
That's what they say. But I actually served for 5 years as a Europe minister, and I watched them being made. I remember having an exchange. I mean, I got on very well with quite a lot of all my colleagues, pretty much, one exception, my fellow Europe ministers. And I remember having a really quite sharp exchange with the German. He's a German liberal, i.e. free trader, right? And great pals. He was a tornado pilot in the reserve, in his reserve activities. And then the Germans blocked the import of cut flowers, I think, from Morocco. I think it was something like that. Right? And I just sent a little note around the table because we all sit at this great table. Again, I can't say WTF. What are you doing? And he sent back an apology note. And that's classic. Every single blasted regulatory structure was not about protecting you from dying from sugar poisoning, says he holding up his cup, but to protect a piece of Europe. And that's the driving force. And the way Europe is organized with big corporate structures, I mean, the corporates all had big presences in Brussels, as you know. I mean, the drive from the airport to the centre is nothing but big corporate signs, and it's the corporates that drive it. It's not even a remotely democratic organisation. It was never set up to be.
On Brexit, I don't know if you remember this. On the night of the referendum, as the results came in, you and I were both at ITV, and I was in the studio with Liam Fox.
All right.
When I think it was Julie Etchingham announced that it's now past the point at which Remain cannot win.
Mm-hmm.
And I walked out of the studio with Liam Fox, and you were waiting to go on. And Liam Fox said to you something along the lines of, "We did it."
Mm-hmm.
And you said, "What do we do now?"
I don't remember that, but go on.
And I said, "Problem is, neither of you have a effing clue what you do now." So what's your take on it now? I mean, you can't pretend it's gone well, can you?
A bit, but go on. It's not as good as it should have been, but go on. Yeah.
And you had a kind of central role at one point because you were Secretary of State for exiting the European Union.
For 2 years.
For 2 years. You had that famous photograph with Michel Barnier. We talked to him about it, by the way. He gave you more credit than you got.
Oh yeah, well it was a fix, but go on. Yeah.
Anyway, so
as he knows, Michel knows that as well.
Anyway, first of all, your general take on how it's gone. Secondly, what the deal that's finally been struck, would you accept is a very bad deal for the UK? And thirdly, how do we fix it?
All right, point one. I mean, I can't remember the phrase, but I can guess what I was thinking because on the night, because the previous 3 months I've been to see George 3 times, George
Osborne.
Osborne, right? And the first time I went to see him, I said, George, you're not winning this, because it was quite a fierce battle going on. And I said, you're not winning this. I've been out in the country. I mean, I wasn't part of the formal Gove run operation. I just did my own debates and so on around
So,
the
so there
place.
was Boris Johnson campaigning eventually, there was Gove campaigning,
And
there was Dominic Cummings
and
campaigning.
there were bits of it. I mean, if you want me to tell you something that was wrong, I thought the side of the bus stuff was ridiculous, and a number of us refused to use the 350 million number because we just thought it was misleading. It's not a straight lie, but it was bloody misleading. Anyway, I went to see him, and I said, "You're going to lose." He said, "No, we're not." I said, "Yes, you are." And as you do, I just plucked a number out of the air, right? I said, "You're going to lose, but not it's going to be a big number. It's going to be something like 52-48, you know." And I literally done that, you know, just plucked a number out of the air. But I wanted to sort of make it crystallise his mind. And then, so end of meeting, I went back about 1 month ago, or thereabouts, or 6 weeks ago, same conversation. I said, George, and this is where I think I might have been thinking about on that night, George, you know, you're going to have to decide what you do if you lose. How are you going to do it? You can't negotiate it. Cameron can't negotiate it. You're going to have to give somebody pretty much absolute power to do the negotiation.
And why can't they negotiate it?
Well, because they've been saying it was all the arguments that they have been making would be played back to them in the negotiation. Cameron had already failed. Let me finish. Listen, I've done more European negotiations than probably anybody in the world.
Sure.
Not over Brexit, but prior to that. And Cameron had done a terrible job of the attempted renegotiation of the immigration. Indeed, that's probably what was the mother and father of Brexit, was actually that poor prior negotiation. If he got that right, that there probably wouldn't have even been a referendum, and if he had, he would have won it. But I said, you know, you're not going to be able to do it. Somebody else, you're going to have to give somebody else a power. You know, a Gove or whoever it is. I wasn't thinking me. I was thinking, because I was completely outside that gilded circle. And he said, oh, well, and he said, well, maybe we'll have to go. And I said, no, that's the wrong response. You'll need stability at home while you're doing this, because it won't be a straightforward negotiation, because the French were already shaping up to be antagonistic, should we say, put it gently. And then I had the same conversation again about 2 weeks before the outcome. And I reran my number plucked out of the air, which now would look magical to him, but it was just a guess. And again, he reiterated, well, maybe we'll have to go. And that's probably what was in my mind at the time.
I think one of the things you're about to say, because I've heard you say it before, is it could have all been done much better. There was nothing wrong with Brexit. The problem was the way it was implemented.
That's why I resigned.
Right.
That's precisely why I resigned.
But
it isn't just saying
many of the arguments that you and other Brexit supporters make seem to me, in retrospect, politically naive. It was obvious, I think, that many of the things that went wrong were likely to go wrong. Betting the country on a path where everything's going to go right, where you're going to land exactly the right kind of Brexit, given the realities, the Tory party, Cameron, Theresa May, all this stuff, is being overly optimistic. The chances are, when you trigger something like that, it's going to be messy and nasty.
Well, yeah, it might be. I mean, look, but whichever way you go, you're betting. Staying in is a bet as much as leaving is a bet.
Sure.
All right. And staying in, I mean, it's one of the issues here is we're doing better in aggregate economic terms on technology investment than everybody in Europe put together. We're doing better in growth terms than Germany, France, Italy. We're doing better in export terms than we've ever done before in total terms. Where's the million unemployed that was supposed to be coming out? That was a CBI bet. The Treasury forecast was 800,000 unemployed. Where's all that? It's rubbish, right? Now, so both sides made mistakes in this argument. No two ways about that. I hope both sides would see that. But the catastrophic collapse hasn't happened.
That's not what I'm saying, David. I'm not.
No. But I'm making a point to you. You said
I still think it was a catastrophic decision.
Well, you do. I don't. I mean, and we can talk numbers till the cows come home and bore your listeners and viewers to tears if you want. But because unfortunately despite myself, I'm expert in these bloody things. The simple truth is, whichever way you went was a bet.
But let me interrupt something. I think your biggest mistake was you bet on a world of free trade at a moment when the world was becoming protectionist. You launched this in 2016, and it was all about big markets in China, US, India. Europe's not growing quickly. These other places are growing quickly. And you entered a world in which Trump was throwing up tariff barriers. The US have now got 110% tariffs on Chinese vehicles. Trump is going to come in, if he comes in November, with 60% tariffs on China, 10% tariffs on the rest of the world. We're in a world where Modi, Xi Jinping, all these major economies are not the dream of the 80s and early 90s of free trade. It's a protectionist world. And we're in a very exposed position.
The hard truth, Rory, is none of it's as bad as it was before '95. Firstly, I mean, you go back,
but it's reversing dramatically.
Wait a minute. Go back and look. Right, there is a different issue, which I think you got a point on, but it's over and above Brexit, right? But in terms of free trade, still the Pacific is going to be a faster growing entity than Europe will ever be, ever again in our lifetime.
But I'm not saying it's not growing fast. What I'm saying is that unfortunately we've entered. What matters to us is yes, growth,
right.
But also the question of how much
as high as they've ever been,
how much of this can we access? And it's not just protectionism; it's also that international security is changing. There are other reasons why opening up to China doesn't look as smart as it did in 2016.
Listen, on international security, I'm afraid Europe trying to interpose itself as a sort of second NATO is a bad idea, an absolutely bad idea. And it's dangerous.
Well, it's not a bad idea if Trump comes back and J.D. Vance comes back.
NATO itself is a better entity for that, I'm afraid. It really is.
The point I'm making is that we're decoupling, de-risking from places like China because of international security.
No, we are.
Or we should be, shouldn't we?
No, so you're replacing wish with actuality with wish. Look,
well, the whole world is decoupling, de-risking from China.
Really? How are they decoupling?
Well, I just told you. The United States is about to put 60% tariffs in place against China.
How are they decoupling? Do you have a computer?
60% tariffs against China.
Do you have a computer?
Yes, I have a computer.
Yeah, right. The graphics chips in it will come from Taiwan. There is nowhere else in the world they come from.
Sure.
So you're not decoupling that. You're not decoupling your electronics at all.
Nobody's putting tariff barriers against Taiwan. They're putting tariff barriers against China.
But that's where it comes from. Most of our trade is with Taiwan. That's the first thing to know about this. Secondly, of course, there is an issue there in terms of dealing with free trade in a security challenged world. That is an absolute truth, and no one would go around.
And it's not one that you talked about in 2016, is it?
Being inside the European Union with our hands fettered is a better way of dealing with that. I'd like to take you back to the 90s when I tried to do it.
Have you finished trade? I want to come back to your kind of journey through the Tory party, because I wrote down this morning a list. So you've gone through, not you personally, but the Tory party has gone through Thatcher, Major, Haig, Ian Duncan Smith, Howard, Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak.
Yeah.
Who was the best? Who was the worst?
Thatcher was the best by a long margin.
And the worst?
Well, Truss, but Truss, I guess.
Who was making you pause?
Well, I was pausing whether you counted Truss in the league at all, really. You know,
She was Prime Minister.
She was Prime Minister for 5 minutes, but I mean, look,
who's your runner-up on both?
Gosh, I mean, there's such a gap between Thatcher and the rest. It's really hard to give a runner-up.
Really?
Yeah. This is interesting, I think, in the context of what Rory and I were just talking about, because you see, 1975 is the last time I can remember the world being so chancy as it is now. All right. And
chancy as in dangerous.
Dangerous, yeah. Risky, sorry, that's a better word. Because Rory's right about the security trade interface. That's really important. But we've got that. We've got domestic problems, health service in particular. Wes Streeting, I think, is a good man, but I think he'll still struggle. We've got just so many challenges, right? And the last time we were in this position like this was when we dropped Ted Heath and replaced as a leader of the party with Margaret Thatcher. At the time, it looked like a very long shot. Mm-hmm. It really did. I mean, I was a student leader. I'd known her when she was education secretary, and I'd been the leader of the Conservative students in the country, and I sort of got. I was one of these people who always argued with her. She always picked a fight with me. Never really knew why, but nevertheless, that was a sign of affection, I think, on her part. And we wondered whether we'd made a terrible mistake more than once. I did, and but she set about these spectacular strategic aims with incredible tactical caution, something I think Blair copied in a way, you know? And she sort of salami sliced every problem to divide it down, deal with it very analytically. She would very often dismiss the conventional wisdom altogether, the sort of what I talk about views the establishment wisdom, but she dismissed that and to start from fundamental principles. So she was an order of magnitude different in her approach, in her analytical capacity, in her methods. If you had to go and see her about something which was in any way controversial, even if she agreed with you, Ian Gow said to me once, explaining when I was about to go and see her and go through this process, my boy, you have to know your arguments, you have to know the footnotes to your arguments, and you have to know the footnotes to your arguments. And if you don't, there'll be a pair of tyre tracks across you and she'll be gone. And he was exactly right. And that's how she assessed policies. It's also how she assessed personalities. Why her cabinet was full of what others sort of as left-wing people like Waldegrave and Patton, both Pattons and so on. It was because they stood up to her, you know, and that was a fabulous way. Now, I don't know anybody since then who's taken that sort of stance, which is why I say it's an order of magnitude different.
And of course, if we go back to the point where you almost became leader, it was that time when David Cameron followed
2005, yeah.
Michael Howard. Why do you think you lost that, and why do you think you won?
Mixture of things. I made a bad speech.
At the conference?
That was the sort of nub of it, but it wasn't the only part. I mean, the system didn't want me. It's very simple, you know, and there were lots of handicaps along the way. But there we are.
Why did the system not want you?
I don't really know, but I mean, I've had a number of people come to me after and say, "Oh, well, so and so, this funder, or whatever, told me not to support you," and so on. I wasn't aware at the time. I just, because blithely ploughed on.
You'd been in the lead. You were the favourite.
Yeah.
You had a lot of votes amongst members of Parliament, and then suddenly the whole thing kind of collapsed in a few days. And Cameron had started with something like 5 or 6 supporters. I mean, a tiny number.
Yeah.
And had somehow come roaring through. What would it have been like if you'd been Prime Minister? What would a David Davis premiership have been? What would you like to have done with the country?
Probably still be in Europe for a time.
But tell us. Or imagine you became Prime Minister in 3 years' time. What would you be doing with the country?
Well, I'd shoot myself. I'm not interested in doing it really at this point in time. What would be different? Probably less than you think. More fuss, more worry about meritocracy, more concern about. I think one of the great. Sorry, we're going to go off in another rabbit hole, so I'll make this short. One of the great tragedies of modern times is that I grew up in an era when meritocracy was at its maximum in this country. I mean, we had 20% of kids going to grammar schools, and therefore a large number of working class kids going to grammar schools and getting into university. I thought that when I was a teenager, the middle class was growing like mad, so opportunities were growing. The schooling system with grammar schools meant a large number, so many kids going to grammar school, a large number were working class, and that now, today, irrespective of government, by the time they get to 11, 35% of children their English and their maths is not good enough to make progress. So in essence, the state has failed them by the time they're 11 years old. If you take that number for free school meal kids, i.e. the poorest decile of the population, that's 50%. That is a scandal on a grand scale, to me anyway. Things like that would have been...
And why did Labour not fix it under Blair?
I think we did. I think we made massive progress on those issues under Labour.
But not in that number. Not in the number I was giving you. It stayed much. It's got slowly worse over the years. You know, I don't really know. I mean,
so you're saying you'd put education at the heart of a...
Well, I'm just saying. Look, social mobility, meritocracy, if you like, as in my view, faded over the years. It's not got better in Britain since. And
that's not the story that Britain tells itself.
Eh?
That's not the story.
I know it's not the story Britain tells itself. I mean, the little what happens is the governments pick out little pieces that suit them. All right. So and they're often legitimate. So, for example, the last government will reasonably point to reading standards. Right. Why do they do that? Because they introduced phonics, GID, junior minister, probably made as big a difference as any minister in government the last decade, by just introducing phonics. But that's one piece of the puzzle. It hasn't solved the overall problem. And I think now we're actually at a time where we could do something about that. I mean, the new government's talking about using AI much more, right? Schools, you can easily introduce a system whereby kids get taught absolutely to their own capability. What tends to happen today is the bottom 20%, 30%, 40% fall off the bottom because the teacher's got to teach to a centre somewhere. It'll teach to the ones that are in the IQ 100 group, if you like. You use an old-fashioned measure. And you could actually completely transform the classroom. And that would deal with my problem that I just talked about, but it also would deal with the young David Davis sitting in physics reading a novel because physics is too easy and he should have done it in 2 years earlier, whatever. So that would be one area I'd be very keen on.
David, let's
But
come
it's
back.
bigger than just education.
Let's come back. So, give us your pitch to be Prime Minister. What would have been the vision?
Let's be clear. I don't want to be Prime
Okay,
Minister.
but you did want to be Prime Minister. You ran to be leader in 2005. You could have been Prime Minister in 2010.
You wanted me to admit a mistake. There we are.
So
that was a mistake.
You ran to be leader in 2005.
Yeah.
Could have been Prime Minister in 2010. What would you have done with the country? What's your vision of what you would
Well,
have done different to what David Cameron
I would have
did?
taken the meritocratic issue head on. Internationally, I don't like foreign wars generally. I don't like wars, and foreign wars are automatic and tautological. But I didn't approve of the Iraq War, as you know. Didn't approve of what we did in Libya. I actually campaigned to stop us bombing Syria. Not because I think I like the Syrian regime. It's a horrible regime, but we were just going to kill 300 conscripts for no purpose, So it'd be a very different approach on that front. Be a bit more assertive with America. I mean, we have tended historically to behave like a colony, frankly. The most recent example, Assange, the extradition treaty, things like that. At home, I tend to be a low-tax Tory, but a balanced books low-tax Tory, not a speculative low-tax Tory, and so on. So, that's the sort of picture. But,
Yeah.
I haven't thought about this for decades.
And this picture is so anti-establishment. You talk a lot about the establishment. Don't like the establishment. Anti-establishment.
Well, I think with respect, Rory.
No, you think I'm part of the establishment. We've done this.
No. But we've had a couple of prime ministers who've been Etonians, Oxbridge, and truth be told, I mean, Cameron was okay domestically. I think he was a disaster internationally.
But David, we don't disagree on this.
No,
you
no.
have a weird picture that somehow I'm like Cameron. I
No.
profoundly
You're all
disagree
part of
with
the same
that.
class. You're all part of the same class.
You're going on to the second. And the other old Etonian?
Was Boris.
And him?
Well, don't you remember the phrase "in the name of God, go"? I mean, I wanted rid of him because I just thought he was morally not up to the job. Let's put it that way.
So let's loop back. I don't want to get pulled in this. You've
No,
got
no,
this.
no.
You enjoy this idea.
I'm just
that you enjoy.
teasing you. Go on.
But
I'm teasing
it's daft.
Listen, I
'cause
work
it's-
with
David,
other members of the establishment all the time. So.
It's daft. I mean, it's completely daft. I, unlike you, left the Conservative Party because of Boris.
Yeah.
Right. This idea that somehow I'm part of that is ridiculous, right? And I disagree with David Cameron profoundly and these kind of things.
All right,
okay.
I'm winding you up. Come on.
Successfully, because I think it's daft,
Yeah.
this particular view. But anyway, you're anti-establishment.
Wow.
You're very suspicious of foreign wars and foreign engagements.
Yeah.
You're in favour of low taxes.
Yeah.
You're in favour of Brexit and leaving the European Union.
Yeah.
Some of this seems to echo with a whole trend in politics, which is a form of gentle populism, no?
Well, what we've got at the moment is a mixture of unpopular populism, some partially popular populism. No, this is the last thing. I mean, who was it? I'm trying to think who it was. Oh, yes, it was Jonathan Dimbleby. I was talking to about assisted dying, one of his big campaigns, and I basically persuaded me that he had a point, really. And I said to him, somebody had written to me saying 80% of your constituents think this, and he roared with laughter. He said, "You're the last person in the world to pay attention to that line of argument," and it's broadly true. I don't pay attention to that line of argument. Populists who are populist because they think it's going to be popular are a disaster. Generally, they go down the Pujadist route. I don't need to explain to you that, which got a maximum of about 30% of the population ever support some horrific sort of simplification. So no, it's not populist. Occasionally, it touches on things that people agree with, but it's not populist.
And why do you think Donald Trump is in such a strong position? Why do you think he's in a pole position to potentially win in the United States?
Well, because he does make simple calls, but I think it's a bit like the last election. I think it's a rejection of what's already there, that it hasn't worked for people for whatever reason. And at the end of the day, democracy's more often than not about what's right for you and your family, right? And if you and your family are suffering, got a bad job, got paying too much taxes, can't afford to pay the bills, can't get a place in hospital, your kids can't buy a house. I'm talking British things rather than American things, but all those things tend to make you reject what's there and then go to whatever else is there which seems to meet it. And it's very easy to talk about the answer. As you know better, well, you both know, it's 1,000 times easier to talk about the answers than to deliver the answers. And that's where populists have a short-term advantage until the moment they get power.
My final question, and thanks for coming in and thanks for all your time. Where do you think the Tory party should go now, and where do you think it will go now?
Well, I think it should take some time, do a lot of rethinking. I mean, you will remember better than anybody the first couple of years in opposition, in a way, are a sort of waste of time for an opposition trying to talk to the public because they're not listening. I think Peter Lilly said it when we lost in '97. The public would like not to hear from you for the next year or so,
Yeah.
and we should use that time to think very hard about a whole range of policies. Housing policy we haven't touched on. I think our housing policy has been weak or cowardly. I think the new Labour housing policy will crash into other issues because ironically, it's unplanned. I would go down a route of the post-war housing commissions and whatever, new town commissions and so on.
So take time on that as well.
And yeah. So those sorts of things, schooling, as I talked about, I think one of the real failures of the Blair time, other than the international ones, the real failures of the Blair time was the higher education issue. I think we've got that wrong. I don't like student loans. I don't like tuition fees. I don't like the way we've handled that. So there's a whole series of things of that sort of nature as well, which need to be addressed.
That's quite a big call. You're basically saying you think Rishi Sunak should hang around for a couple of years while the party sorts itself out.
I've told him that. I've said to him, I think you should stick around long enough for us to see what the candidates to succeed you are like in opposition. Because if they're no good at opposition, we'll stay in opposition until we find somebody who is.
Who would you back if you had to vote now?
At the moment, none of them. I've got no dog in this fight because I literally want to see how. I mean, I would go for the one who can actually make a strong argument from the dispatch box in these circumstances. There are no more difficult circumstances than now. So that's the test. I don't start. I mean, and I don't like the right wing grouping. I mean, I think Braverman's done real harm. I think, and on the left, I'm not terribly impressed either, I'm afraid. So I'm going to measure by performance.
And Farage?
Oh, well, I think those are my colleagues who want to strike some sort of deal are whistling in the wind. I mean, my comment, which sort of obviously caught people's imagination, was if somebody burns down the golf club, you don't give them membership. That's a symbolic way of characterising what I want to say.
My final one. What have you learned? I mean, you've now been in the House of Commons. You're just one term behind being Father of the House. I mean, the oldest people in the House of Commons came
Except
in.
I broke my term with a
Oh yeah, the little by-election.
But came in '83. So you've had a huge experience of the House of Commons. What have you learned practically as a politician? If you were, just the bruising experience of those decades in politics, what have you learned makes a good politician? What makes a bad politician? That's my final one.
Oh God, we started out talking about PhD theses. The simple thing is, when most people come in, they're altruistic. Most people come in, they're altruistic, and that dies with time. For not everybody, but about 80%, and it's eroded by careerism and the vagaries of life. And the first lesson is you've got to hang on to the reasons you came in. That's what matters. And you must always revisit that. That's my argument earlier about trying to be logical rather than necessarily part of the pack. That's the first thing. Second thing is treat Parliament seriously. Almost nobody does. And it's getting weaker. It's actually much weaker now than it was under Thatcher. The third thing is remember who put you there. This is why I started by talking about social mobility, meritocracy, and so on. Because it's very, very easy, again, over time to disappear into the inwardness of the House of Commons and lose track of the outside. And the fourth thing is think 3 times before you accept an easy solution to anything, because they almost always fail.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you, David.
So, Rory, what is it? I mean, I take the piss out of you being a member of the establishment all the time, and it doesn't bother you. What is it about David Davis? He just lobs in a few establishment hand grenades, and whoosh, off you go.
Well, it's a good question. I think that one of the things is it's a bit like you interviewing Jeremy Corbyn. These things feel much more raw and personal when you've been part of the same party. So obviously I spent nearly 10 years in Parliament with David Davis, and we were on different sides of almost everything. We were on different sides of Brexit. We were on different sides, the type of leaders we were supporting. We had different visions for the Conservative Party. And part of David Davis's push, and there's a sense these very innocent words like, I believe in meritocracy and I'm anti-establishment, were in fact used by people like David Davis to attack the kind of Cameron centre-left direction of the party and to try to drag it back more towards the Brexit right. This meritocracy thing, was the great line of Dominic Raab, who was David Davis's chief of staff and very much took up David Davis's mantle. So what you're seeing there is on the one hand, getting slightly itchy about the fights within the Tory party, and on the other hand, thinking, listen, okay, yes, I went to the same school as David Cameron and Boris Johnson, but profoundly, I'm not the same person as Boris Johnson. And unlike you, dear Mr. David Davis, I actually resigned from the Conservative Party in protest against him while you stuck around.
But Rory, you can't call him Mr. David Davis because he is Sir David Davis. I thought, you see, if I'd have been involved in a sort of battle of establishmentism, and I said, hold on a minute, Mr. David Davis, I didn't take a bloody knighthood from Boris Johnson. Anyway, I quite enjoyed it. I stayed out of that bit. He is an interesting character, though. He is a real survivor.
And so just tell us about your relationship with him, because I think he's one of this group of people, along with Alan Clark and Nicholas Soames, that you hung out with in the 1980s. And it's a really fascinating vision. So here's this left-wing journalist from the Mirror, ultimately very close to Neil Kinnock, John Smith, Tony Blair, who for some reason has a real penchant for going out with these rather kind of colourful, indiscreet right-wing Tories. What's going on there?
Well, that is exactly right. And when Alan Clark died, I remember the two people I spoke to about it were Nicholas Soames and David Davis. I remember David Davis, it was David Davis who said to me, it sounds like he's just turned his face to the wall and decided to die, and he couldn't face anybody seeing him. I was very friendly with them. I mean, David Davis is one of the few Tory MPs who's been in my kitchen. And I think you've even been in my kitchen, Rory. So, yeah, it was. And I'd completely forgotten the thing about how at one point he had access to all these people in the city and he was going to put together 300 million quid for him to buy the Mirror and I would edit it.
Alastair, can I come in on that? Because this is another fascinating thing. One of the themes is that these people like Alan Clark and David Davis seem to have really taken a shine to you. As far as I remember, Alan Clark was trying to give you a Rolls Royce and David Davis was trying to give you a newspaper.
It was a Bentley. Nicholas Soames never gave me anything. My most memorable exchange with Nicholas Soames was when he stopped me by a cash machine in the House of Commons. This was when we were in government and I was working for Tony Blair. And he said, how would you feel if I tried to pass a law banning Burnley fucking football club? I said, well, I wouldn't be very happy. He says, well, that's how I feel about your fucking fox hunting. And stormed off. No, I was very friendly with all three of them. But listen, I was a journalist, Rory, so I had to, and a journalist on the Daily Mirror, a paper that was not very well disposed towards the Conservative Party. But I think they saw me as useful in the little sort of internecine battles that they were all fighting in. Alan Clark was just a wonderful gossip. He liked going out with people who liked a good natter. David Davis has got that about him as well. But I think the thing about David Davis, the reason why I think he is an interesting figure to have on the podcast, is he's sort of is a survivor, and I quite admire that. I mean, and the other thing I quite admire about him is he just sort of keeps going. He's 75. I mean, if Labour do pass this bill that stops anybody sitting in the House of Lords after the age of 80, he's going to miss his seat in the House of Lords. And that's another thing you should have said to him, Rory. Come on then, David. As this great hater of the establishment, would you go to the House of Lords?
The things that I think wound me up probably most were his arguments on the death penalty, which I thought were disingenuous. I think he's somebody who came out strongly in support of the death penalty and got a lot of applause from the right wing of the Conservative Party for being pro-death penalty, at a time when it was actually quite brave of some of my colleagues back in the 80s to be anti-death penalty. And he now produces this very sort of strange justification. Oh, well, I'm in favor of the death penalty, but, I'm worried about whether the legal system would be able to carry it through. And the other one was on gay marriage. For the record, priests in the Church of England are not obliged to conduct gay marriages. In fact, they're not actually allowed to conduct gay marriages in the Church of England. So the argument that he's trying to make, that this was somehow putting unfair pressure on priests, forcing them to conduct gay marriages when they wouldn't want to, is just not true.
Sorry, is that right, that priests don't do gay marriages?
Priests don't do gay marriages in church. The gay marriage bill was a civil bill. It was a civil bill. It's about being able to get married in the eyes of the state, not in the eyes of the church. And it's up to the individual churches to decide whether or not they want to follow through on the marriages. And David Davis is one of the people who's leading the opposition to this bill, and leading it on completely disingenuous grounds, and continuing years after it to try to insist that I'm wrong.
Okay, what else wound you up?
Well, I think that I thought it was interesting because I'm sympathetic towards his civil liberties stuff. I admired the stance that he took. I was interested that he became close to Chakrabarti. I think we share similar views about defense and security. I kept hoping as a conservative that I could find common ground with that side of the Conservative Party. And it's a real kind of body blow to be perpetually reminded that they really dislike people like me. They see us as wet establishment lefties and won't, and and they're always right about everything. You will never actually get them say, I was wrong about gay marriage. I was wrong about the death penalty.
He admitted Brexit was not going very well.
Don't think he said he was against Brexit. I'm pretty sure it's not been implemented right, but I'm still in favor of it.
He's definitely that. Anyway, well, I thought it was very entertaining to sit watching you get more and more aggravated by his. And the more aggravated you got, the more he leant back in his chair. I thought he was going to fall over the back of his chair at one point. Anyway, good fun, Rory, good fun. And let's hope the listeners enjoyed it as much as I did.
Thank you very much.
See you soon. Bye.